Hello there, welcome to my review of the Rockford Files Season 2, Episode 10, 2 into 5.56 Won't Go, written by Stephen Cannell and directed by our Columbo connection for this episode, Gino Schwark, who also directed the Columbo episode Lovely But Lethal. The episode begins with a car in hot pursuit of a jeep. In the jeep is a colonel, and in the car is a sergeant and a besuited man. Colonel Bowie shakes his tail and manages to leave a message on Jim's answer phone.
Jim, this is Colonel Daniel Hart Bowie. It's important that I speak to you right away.
As he continues on his way, he's stopped by a sheriff, played by ubiquitous character actor Charles Napier, who turns out to be in cahoots with the men who were following the colonel.
You won't do it now, Colonel? You want me to put this nightstick upside your head?
They take him away, and we cut to Jim and Rocky in Jim's trailer, not yet having checked his messages. When he does, he tries to call Bowie, but before he gets too far, Dennis turns up with the military police, wanting to ask Jim a few questions. Despite Jim's refusal, the military aren't so easy to get around as the LAPD, so we next see him with a Colonel Hopkins, played by a young Mitchell Ryan, who starred in Cannell's first show, The Short-Lived Chase. We find out that Bowie is dead and was Rockford's commanding officer during the Korean War. During his time in the army, Jim was a professional scrounger and was regularly demoted and promoted depending on what he scrounged and from where.
I'm sure Colonel Bowie intended for you to scrounge one of our tanks from one of our units.
Jim isn't the least bit intimidated and, after their brief conversation, returns home, only to be confronted by Bowie's daughter, Shaina, played by a returning Jessie Wells, armed with a gun and demanding answers. Jim doesn't have any, but manages to talk her down. She's certain her father was murdered and wants him to investigate, which he pointedly refuses.
Well, I'm just not available. That's final.
Until he doesn't.
I will want to keep your expense receipts.
Plenty of intrigue to be getting on with in this episode. We know who did it, which gives us an advantage over Jim, and means that when he does encounter one of the villains, it will increase the tension for us because we'll know they're villains. We don't know why Bowie has been killed though, so the mystery is still up for grabs, and we also don't know who else might be involved. Based on previous episodes, it could realistically be anyone we meet, which also helps to increase the tension. Is Shaina really who she says she is? Cleverly, she doesn't tell Jim anything about her father he doesn't already know. He's the one who identifies her, and he tells her information about her father.
You remember his drinking habits, don't you?
Yeah, a glass of wine before dinner, and that was it.
Is Hopkins involved? He tries to squeeze Jim for information, but is it to help the case, or to find out how much he might know? All tantalising hooks for us to ponder over. Also, in this first act, we see a few comedy staples being used to end scenes, with Jim twice saying he's not going to do something right before we see him do it. Not only are these intended as some added humour, but they also inform us of Rockford's character, willing to avoid getting into certain kinds of trouble while actively getting involved in what is sure to lead to trouble. At Colonel Bowie's house, Shaina and Jim look around, with Shaina eventually revealing information only Bowie's daughter could know.
He always kept that picture over here on the desk. He's had 10 different quarters that I can remember, and he always kept it over here.
Before the arrival of Sergeant Harvey Slate, who knows Shaina.
Harvey!
Shaina, honey.
The sergeant who was chasing down Bowie.
I don't know what to tell you, except that, well, you know, my loss is almost as great as yours.
Shaina is happy to reveal who Jim is to him, as he's an old friend, but Jim is no dummy and shines him on.
Sergeant Slate, this is Mr. Ross.
Sanderson.
Once Slate is gone, Shaina and Jim butt heads over his feelings towards the military compared with her father's.
My father was a great soldier, and you spent the entire war trying to find ways to go AWOL.
Before Jim makes a pointed but important statement.
If you feel grief for the man who bounced you on his knee and took you out to the park, that's fine, that's great. Why mourn a military record? Leave that to the men who write obituaries.
A statement that Shaina doesn't take kindly to, but it's pretty clear from her performance here that it's because it hits a bit too close to the truth.
But he was my father.
It's a great example of what this show had always been but was growing more comfortable with, looking at the psychology of people in amongst the heightened situation of whatever mystery Rockford's involved in. It's never afraid to use a little of its running time, not just to show how well Rockford understands people, but also how these conversations just weren't happening on TV at the time. Jim heads back to his motel only to be confronted by the crooked sheriff, who puts the heat on like only Charles Napier can.
Spread out against that wall, please.
Before cuffing Jim and driving him out to the middle of nowhere. If Jim is intimidated, he certainly doesn't show it, even when the sheriff slaps him around. As the sheriff is getting his instructions, Jim is able to outsmart them all and do what he does best, annoy the hell out of the villain enough to give Jim the edge to escape. He now knows one of the players and has the surname of another. He reconnects with Shaina, who has taken what Jim told her on board, and confesses that the reason she can only mourn Bowie as a colonel and not her father is because she thinks he didn't love her. Jim once again espouses some of his wisdom, making her feel better this time.
He was very good at being a soldier, and he had a rough time with people.
And then tells her what happened to him. He's discovered the sheriff isn't a sheriff, but that's about it. Luckily, Jim is an excellent detective, and the next day is able to track down the car that Quinton Davis was driving.
If that Alice has gone and took one of them cemetery limos, Quinton's gonna skin her alive.
Finding out who Bowie's informant was.
Alice or Terry, one or the other.
Unfortunately, he also discovers that Shaina has gone off with the crooked Sergeant Slate, so goes after the informant, who isn't an informant at all.
They're smuggling things off the base. Weapons and stuff in hearses.
Assigned by Davis to honey-trap Bowie and take him off base when the smuggling was about to take place.
He came to you and told you, not knowing you were in on it?
She didn't know they were going to kill Bowie, though, so spills everything to Jim, who takes his info to Colonel Hopkins, who thankfully doesn't turn out to be in on it.
What they've been doing is putting the stuff in a hearse with the bodies of the dead soldiers that die on the base and smuggling it out.
The way this mystery is solved is a little clunky here, as it basically involves finding one person who tells Rockford everything, rather than any actual mystery solving. It also wasn't particularly difficult to find her. So much of this middle act is superfluous to the plot, and while the character work we get is great, the scenes intended to create tension end up forcing the story to rush. This all leads to a big action set piece that Cannell would come to embrace in later shows like the A-Team, but feels a little out of place in a Rockford episode as he and the military go in guns blazing. With one particular shot looking like it's straight out of an A-Team episode. They do manage to retain Rockford's reluctance to shoot anyone.
Don't do that!
But the whole thing doesn't quite work for me. In the epilogue, we find out Bowie saved Jim's life in Korea, which is why, despite their differences, Jim owed Bowie his life.
He came back for me, and he was commanding officer.
This episode has a lot going for it. The interpersonal drama between Shaina and Jim, and the spectre of Colonel Bowie that hangs over them both is brilliantly done, with just enough to make its point without turning into melodrama. Unfortunately, the plot itself doesn't quite work for me. It's not just because of the ending. Jim does very little sleuthing. The way he gets involved isn't quite persuasive enough, especially when we find out about his and Bowie's relationship, and it's all solved a little too easy, with Hopkins just being a few steps behind Jim. Rockford is sort of obsolete to the plot in the end, but is crucial to Shaina and his own emotional well-being. It's the imbalance of these two factors that so many other episodes in this series manage to balance so well, that leaves me to give this a 3 out of 5. Lots of good things, but it doesn't live up to the promise. Thank you. Goodbye.